hello everybody, Neil Foley from the Business Growth Club. Really fortunate today to have Kate White with us from Front Page Media, who's a copywriter extraordinaire, and we're going to talk about all things concerning copyright and the copywriting and the use of words and being a wordsmith, and hopefully you'll gain a lot from it. So, morning to you, Kate, how are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Looking forward to this.
Me too.
So, if we think in terms of copywriting, Kate, why is copywriting so important in this age when everything's digital and you could almost think words are a bit old-fashioned, don't they?
Yeah, it's funny actually because communication has never been more important and more used, I suppose, is a terrible way of saying it. But we actually communicate with our words on social media all day long these days. We even though there is obviously a lot of audio and video and all the rest of it, generally even that we're thinking all the time about the words we use, how we're presenting ourselves, whether it's in our business or whether it's in our day-to-day personal lives. We're constantly reinforcing our brand, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose that's true, isn't it? Because even if you're in social media, you're using words, or you've got a script that you're doing for a video, for a vlog or something like that. So it's just as important as it ever was?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that people now expect you to have a grasp of words that is very professional. I think people don't accept poor use of language anymore, and it's certainly something that you have to be fairly consistent with as well across all the ways in which you're communicating with your customers or potential customers. In emails, people expect them to be well written and with decent grammar. I think we all know how we feel when we receive an email where our name is spelt wrong, or it's words are spelt wrong, or it's boring. You just click delete, that's the end of it.
Yep.
And it's quite savage. So making those impressions count is really key, I think.
Yes, and I guess you've got to grab people's attention because we're all distracted. We were talking earlier about when we were younger, there wasn't necessarily a lot to do, but now there's so many distractions. If you want to grab somebody's attention, you've got to do it pretty quickly, haven't you?
You've got to be really quick, and I think that you're competing all the time against so many other forces. I mean, we're all getting so distracted by our phones going off or someone interrupting you. You've got to work quite hard to keep people's attention. So I think using words to their best effect, making them engaging, entertaining, informative, is vital, I think, in every aspect of your communication.
And how do you do that in terms of, because you're writing for different people, aren't you? So I might be an engineering company or somebody who's in the technical sphere, and I know you do a lot with soaps that we'll talk about. So how do you determine what's right for the audience?
I think you have to find the voice of your client. For me, I mean, that's one of the things that's really important to me. I often, for the writing that I do, when I write as I do for the soap magazine, I'm writing as Kate White, the soap pundit, and so I know what that voice is because that is obviously my authentic voice, and it's been a voice that's been crafted over many years, and I have a very particular way of talking about soaps. So that voice is obviously constantly there in my head. But when I'm approaching clients and trying to learn about them and their businesses, I really do pay attention to how people speak, how they like to communicate, how they like to present themselves, and if anything, I try and work with that and elevate it in any way I can. So that finding a voice for people and their businesses is, I think, the key to doing copywriting as well as possible.
So is that meaning you're going to do a fact find on them or interview them, and you're trying to get under the skin to see what they... And what happens if you try and find their voice and you think the voice isn't appropriate?
Well, that's always a really interesting one because quite often I think people do have a business that might a voice that is inappropriate for their business.
Yes.
But it's finding ways to give authenticity to a business voice. So you may have someone who works in a particular business and maybe they've got a mouth like a sailor, and I think that happens quite often. And that's fine in day-to-day life. I mean, people find that quite entertaining, but you're obviously not going to use those kind of words in any kind of formal communication. But knowing that people have a kind of edge or a sense of humour or that kind of aspect to their personality, you can still put that into their brand voice without compromising it. It's just that I think people buy from people.
Yes.
So if I did a piece of copy for someone and the copy was incredibly formal and static and it didn't have any personality, but then they met someone who's very jocular and who is full of life and a bit of a character, it wouldn't match up at all. So it would feel really inauthentic. So I think it's about finding a way to marry up the person to the business voice, and that's probably easier when you're dealing with businesses where it's, say, a solo, it's a solopreneur or an entrepreneur. And they're very much dictating the voice of the business, whereas I think for like a large corporate company it almost has to be like a decision about what direction the company communications want to go in, and then you can't be you can't make it that specific.
So it's much harder in some ways for a bigger corporate than just for as you say, a sort of a sole trader or a partnership. For a bigger firm, it's harder, isn't it?
I think for the bigger firms, they've got to be much more strategic about it, because it may be like, for some of the bigger firms, they started off real small. You kind of think about, I suppose Apple is the one that everybody thinks about, and you think about the vision of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak being, running that shop out of their garage, but then if you think about the stories the famous stories that exist around Apple as a brand, they all really hark back to this kind of idea of these scrappy young people trying to make a dent in the world. And even now their messaging all goes back to that. So it is still fairly authentic despite the way it's evolved.
Yes, that's very true actually, isn't it? And the stories you all remember and the copy that you remember have all told quite extraordinary stories, haven't they? And is there a theme in terms of, is it hardship or is it, a struggle to start with and it looked like you might fail and then you make it? Are there themes that you find that you're writing?
I think that the idea of the hero's journey, which is a very traditional storytelling narrative, that comes up time and time again. I mean, I think everyone now really understands that because of things like Star Wars and, pick up any story really, and there's going to have some kind of a hero's journey arc. And I think that we understand how story works effectively and emotionally when it's there's a struggle or there's a desire for something, and then there's got to be a journey before that goal is realised, and those stories I think compel all of us. I think it's programmed into us. So anything where you can tap into that is great, but the reality of a sort of day-to-day life of a normal business isn't Luke Skywalker, is it? It's not.
It's a tad more boring.
Yeah, unfortunately, but that's not to say that there won't be stories within the business. It just means you maybe don't need a 500 million budget to tell it.
Obviously, you're looking at what's the audience, who's the audience you're aiming for, and the rest of it. How often? I mean, I've often thought that must be quite hard, because quite often the business won't necessarily know who the audience is. They're often not that focused, are they? In terms of saying my target market is X. So how do you get around that one?
I think you have to be very clear about directing people, because I think for people that don't quite get that they need to be addressing their customers' needs rather than their own. I mean, there's often I think people say it all the time in blogs, quite often it can be me about the company, or we do this or we do that, and that doesn't necessarily become compelling for the reader. The reader wants to know about them. They want to know what they can learn, how they can get value. So, I think the most effective stories are ones that have some sort of fable or a tale to tell, or a piece of advice or some instruction. So, I encourage people to think about what their customers need from them, what they ask of them, and try and work with that, because without that you're just being very introverted and insular looking, and I think that's very unhelpful with any communication.
And I've tried newsletters in the past, and I think traditionally what would happen is the first newsletter would be really good, because I've dumped all my good ideas into it. The second one, a little bit harder. By the time it's come to the third one, I'm thinking, why on earth did I ever think I was going to do these bloody newsletters? So do you map out a storyline for maybe a year's worth of work or something, and say, right, and then block it into segments and say, well, we'll do this now, and then we'll lead on to that. So are there storylines that you do all the way through?
There are actually, but the way I sort of approach it, because this happens most regularly with people who want to retain a blog. So say they want 1 or 2 blog posts every month, and they're looking for that content and that consistency of content. What we'll tend to do is we'll sit down and we'll plan out 6 months. So it's taking notice of not just the messages you want to put out, but other things that will happen throughout that time. For example, if there's a general election, if there's a day of notes, or something within your industry that's going to be seismic. If there's a new government ruling on something and you know that's coming up, and that's going to really affect your customers or how you do your business, that's something that's really important to talk about, because it shows you're engaged. I did a blog for a company, I won't name them, but they would never have thought to look at podcasts as a source for inspiration, but there was a podcast that was called S-Town, which was the best-selling podcast I think of this year, or the highest, the most downloaded podcast from the makers of This American Life, and there was something within that podcast that was pertinent to their business. So we pulled that out and we said, this podcast is amazing and loads of people have been listening to it, and here's a question that's come up from that podcast and let's answer it for you. And it did really well. It did really well for them because it made them look like they were culturally engaged as well as being experts in their field. So it had, a double focus in that sense.
I can see, that'd be very powerful, wouldn't it?
And it was fun for me to write because I loved that podcast, and so being able to kind of bring in the fact that I'm quite a sort of a voracious podcast listener was super useful for that, and it gave me a chance to write about something I like, which I like nothing better than writing about things I love.
Podcasts are, I know we're doing one now, but I've been listening to more and more podcasts. The bit that surprises me, and different people, you might disagree, I don't know, it's the music that often accompanies the podcast. Do you think that enhances, or is that sort of take away from the experience in your view?
Well, it depends, because if we go back to S-Town, I think the use of music in that is really powerful.
Is it?
And it feels like it's a sort of Southern American Gothic tale, and having the music sort of puts you in that mindset, atmospheric. But there's a lot of podcasts I listen to. I listen to a lot about television and reviewing television shows because I'm obsessed with things like Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead and stuff. And all of that is, the music is rubbish. And I don't care because I just want to hear what people think about Walking Dead that week,
That's the bit that gets me, is that quite often I listen and they'll have music. And you see it more on television now as well. They can't seem to have, you can't seem to have a scene without some frigging music in the background. And sometimes it really, I know it should be subtle, but actually often it isn't. And it can be desperately annoying, can't it?
It can be, but I think it's often annoying for people who are really, really engaged and focused, so they don't need like a musical cue to tell them how to feel. Because I think that's why people use music in those contexts, is to add in a layer of direction for the audience, which
sounds like you should. It sounds like you've failed if you've actually got to. It's a bit like the old audiences you had on the old television shows, with the clapping, and which is quite often a US thing. That, if you need to tell me it's funny, then probably you need to rewrite it.
It's absolutely true. Although, I think sometimes music can be incredibly powerful because, I went and saw the London Philharmonic play all the John Williams themes, and, sitting there and hearing, sitting in an outdoor concert and hearing the Star Wars theme, I don't think there's quite anything quite like it. It puts you straight back in that childhood place, doesn't it?
Music has that ability, doesn't it?
Definitely.
So how did you end up being a copywriter? Because I know you've got a journalistic background.
Yeah, it was a funny thing really because, I decided early on that I wanted to write for a living. I did my journalism qualification after I did my degree, which was a good excuse to have another year at uni. I thought this was going to be a DOS. How wrong I was. It was like just having a job. It was 9 to 5 every day and homework, which was fantastic because, my goodness, it was the best training you could get. I was very fortunate. I went to the best school for journalists in the country and did the top course for magazine journalists, so shout out to City University and their periodical journalism course. But doing that really gave me a solid foundation, and when I did that I did a module on entertainment because my my focus was always that I was going to be writing about films. That's all I cared about, was can I write about films or be involved in films in some way. And throughout the course of my initial couple of years in journalism, I just ended up getting redirected into television.
Yep.
And so in terms of becoming a copywriter, after doing sort of 13 years in entertainment journalism, I wanted to move to Norwich, and there wasn't, I didn't want to work for the local press. I didn't want to do the kind of traditional journalistic jobs that were available here, and I couldn't do the job I was doing then remotely. So I had to make a decision and take a gamble, and I thought, well, it's now or never. So I did that, and thankfully, touch wood, it's paid off. But yeah, it was a real chance to take to try and apply those skills of writing sort of engaging, informative copy, and very silly copy in many ways for the stuff I was writing, and finding a way to use that in business and doing that properly.
Yeah. But you've kept going with the TV stuff, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. I'd had a year off after I left my job, and then they came and asked me back, which was very nice. I know I do 2 days a week for them, so I keep my hand in.
And is this short copy? Because I know we've talked about this before. The short copy is actually really hard to write, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So is this short copy that you're tending to do? Is that where your skills really got honed?
I think that the great thing about the magazine I write for is called Inside Soap, and the great thing about that magazine is that there are very distinct sections. So I still write interviews that are like 1,000, 1,500 words long, but I also write short pieces of copy that are 250 words long. And the first thing you get taught at journalism school is that it's harder to write for The Sun than it is to write for The Guardian, because actually crafting really hard-hitting, tight copy is much tougher than having room to manoeuvre. And I'm not suggesting that what you read in The Sun is better than what you read in The Guardian at all. I'm just saying that that there is an art form to short, concise copy, and it's a skill. One that I think I'm always trying to better. I don't think I think it's very rare to feel that you've really cracked it. It's always a work in progress.
And do you do the same thing as I guess most of us do? If I write something, say an email, and I know it's a difficult email or a difficult piece of work, I've got into the habit of not trying to send it straight away, but then to leave it and walk away and then review it. And nearly always you think, oh my goodness, that's not what I meant to say, or there's a spelling mistake and I hadn't noticed. I mean, what sort of process do you use?
Well, I have my husband Ian, who works with me in the business. He is the person who I run everything by, because I always believe that the combination of the two of us is a winning one, really. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that with emails. I don't actually really ever review stuff in that sense. I tend to know what I want to say, get it down and send it. I'm a bit of a no-nonsense like that, if I'm honest. I think that comes from working in newsrooms where you've got to turn copy around real fast, and you can't really think about it too long because it needs to go out. So
deadlines, I guess. So Ian, you review each other's work?
Yeah, so I'll write something, send it to Ian, he'll have a look at it, give me his suggestions. I'll take those on board or phone up and argue with him. and then the copy will go to the client. And, it is always, there will always be a few little tweaks and changes that will need to be made along the way. But generally, it tends to be that we get it pretty much right first time, and then it's only little bits and pieces to change. It never tends to be that we've gone way off track and they're horrified. So, but again, I put that down to my journalistic career, because I'm used to editors going, I want this and I want this and I want this, and then I've got to go and interpret that and bring it back to them, and you learn how to get that right.
I mean, the stereotypical image of an editor, is that true in terms of them being very direct and bolshy and demanding and male mainly? Definitely
find that it tends to be men.
Yeah.
It has been for me in the titles I've written for. Certainly not the kind of stereotype at all. I mean, the editor of Inside Soap is very far from the stereotype. But then that's quite that publication is quite unique in that it's a very friendly, lovely environment. I think for the friends of mine that work in tabloids and those kind of newsrooms, it is very much the stereotype, and it is a very tough environment, which is one of the reasons why I decided to keep quite clear of that environment.
Yes.
Because I didn't think I would enjoy that very much.
And because deadlines must get in the way of creativity, there must be times when you're thinking, actually, just for whatever reason, I'm not focused, my mind's on other things, and you need to walk away from it, don't you? And I guess if you're on a tabloid or in a deadline situation, it must be a nightmare where you think, I've got to write something.
Actually, do you know what? Funnily enough, that has kept me really productive, because even though I would say it can stifle creativity, because I am a slave to deadlines, I very rarely, well, I never miss a deadline.
No.
God, that's suicide, in my industry. But it helps me not to waffle and not to give myself too much time to talk myself out of things, because I know this has got to be delivered, it needs to be there by this time, so it keeps me really focused. But then with my husband, I mean, he has done journalistic work, but he's worked in other creative writing fields, and because of that, he very much has that opinion that sometimes you need to put it down, walk away, and come back to it fresh. For me, I'm like, no, get on with it.
Get it done.
Yeah.
So can you run multiple projects at the same time where you're
Yeah.
writing about different things? You're able to do that?
I am, and I think sometimes I'll get to the end of the day and I'll feel really drained, because I've basically been jumping in my head from one place to the next.
Yes.
It's a lot easier to sit there and write about soaps all day than it is to write about hairdressing and then
Yep.
investment banking and then networking and then this. Suddenly you feel a little bit schizophrenic, really, with all these different voices in your head.
It's quite difficult, isn't it?
Really, really tricky, and it's certainly something that has been a real challenge for me, actually, in building my business, is learning how to jump between those subjects and maintain my focus.
And I know the other day, I think you met somebody that you needed some help with their son. And what would you say to people who are thinking, actually, they love the use of the language, they love words, and they want to they'd like to make a career out of it? What sort of advice is there that you would give somebody young?
Well, I would say you must write, and often. So the advice I gave to that particular boy was that, have you got a blog? Are you writing? It doesn't matter what you're writing about. If you love football, start writing about football. What are 5 reasons that manager should be sacked? Why is it that you love this player? From a young age, you can really start to build your voice through just writing about the stuff you love. And I mean, when else are you going to have the opportunity to have a roof over your head and food in your belly and write about what you love? Take advantage of it. It's a real privilege. And God, I would love to be sitting there writing about the films of Woody Allen every day, but I just don't think I'm going to be able to pay the mortgage with it, unfortunately.
Did he take that advice on board?
Yeah, he seemed to be really pleased by that, actually, because I think when you are really interested in getting into journalism, you're kind of frustrated, you want to write. So having someone say, write loads, go and do it, it's hopefully a quite liberating thing.
Would you ever, it just popped into my head, would you ever advocate recording and having that transcribed? Or is that something that's a bit of a no-no and you couldn't just work that way?
I think you can do that. I mean, I would find that very difficult to do myself,
Yes.
because I'm better at writing something down than I am at speaking. So,
And you're a touch typist, presumably
Yes.
you can touch type really quickly. And
I can, yeah. I mean, again, I think years and years of writing I never learnt to touch type formally. I just picked it up, and now I could sit and talk to you and type and make something relatively coherent. I wouldn't like to then send that draft straight off to someone, but I mean, I am quick at typing, and that's certainly an advantage. But again, I think, for people that are young, I think people now, they're using keyboards all the time. I
Yes.
think you build up that resilience.
yeah.
As
And
a
they can be
typist.
astonishingly quick, even if they're not using all your fingers. I mean, they're just very dexterous at it, aren't they?
They are, and I think it's just going to improve and improve.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that people say at the moment, it's all going to be about video, it's all going to be about video. And I think, is it though? Because we still primarily communicate through the written words. I think quite often. I mean, now can you imagine picking up a phone to talk to someone who you could just text that message to? You wouldn't do it, would you?
No, you wouldn't.
So you're still using words.
And I know I've done a fair bit of video, and at the end of the day, you try it when you first start, and you ad lib. You think, I know what I'm going to say, and then you do loads of ums and ahs, and your brain wanders away and says, "Oh, there's a spider," and it's just amazing what your brain does.
Yeah.
So actually, you have to write it down, don't you? Because you've got to get your message over still in a short, succinct fashion. So it actually has to be transcribed, and you have to read it. So I think I agree with you word-wise. In terms of a final question, Kate, if you were yourself but 20 years younger, so you were a young person setting out in the world, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself?
In terms of writing?
Just life in general.
Just life in general. Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, I would spend a lot less time worrying about boys.
Fair comment.
Yeah. I think, God, the amount of it's one of those things. I think about all the very talented women that are in my life, and the amount of hours wasted over silly boys.
They're all silly, who then become silly men.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, we could have probably, redefined the world with those wasted hours. But no, I think in all seriousness, I'd say, trust your instincts and be confident in your abilities, because I think that people analyse themselves to death and try and worry all the time about how they're presenting themselves to the world. But I think you instinctively know the things that you're good at and your strengths, and trusting them and following where they take you is really important, I think, to happiness. And it's certainly been for me, being able to identify that I love books, I love words, and then making a career out of that has brought me a lot of happiness. So I'd encourage other people to do that.
Sounds like good advice. Well, thank you very much indeed, Kate. What we'll do at the bottom of the transcript, we'll have Kate's email address and contact details. So if people wanted to talk to Kate, she's very open and very willing to help. And thank you very much indeed, Kate, and see you soon.
Thank you very much, Neil.